posing a question. What do we do with this clear call? There is a call for collaboration, multidisciplinarity, building bridges between basic science and science which is supporting big challenges of the development goals. So how do we respond to it beyond the conference, beyond the nice statements? We have two distinguished panels to shed some light on this very concrete question. First panel, which will be deliberating about this question, how to respond to this call, is a panel where the heads of the international agencies, either science policy or funding coordination bodies, will share their views about how to tackle this call. And we have a very eminent and distinguished chair and moderator. You know him all, Peter Gluckman. He is currently president of the International Science Council, former chief scientist of the New Zealand government. Peter, the floor is yours to take this important challenge.
Thank you. We hope that we can make this a little bit more interactive. So after I've made some initial provocations, I wonder if the panelists would sit down below and we can actually have an interaction. I don't know why Pavel asked me to chair this session, except that I'm tended to have a reputation for being rather blunt and rather frank. And I think that what I'm going to try and do today in my initial remarks is make some provocations from what we've heard during the course of the day. And I'd like to recall particularly the comments that Marcia made right at the beginning of the day, because I think that there's an echo and a remarkable commonality between what she said at the beginning and what I'm going to put forward as a provocation now. It's worth reflecting that the construct of the SDGs created many of the challenges that Marcia alluded to. They were a political rather than a scientific construct. It siloed thinking, made it hard for both policymakers and societies to work on these issues when they were split in so many ways. And they pushed science into rather narrow thinking, although there are many other reasons that have been alluded to for why science is siloed. It did not place the value of the active scientific community into policy making at the forefront. The scientists came after the SDGs had been designed. And even now, the state of science advice into the multilateral system and into domestic systems is very inchoate. Large amounts of money has been spent in the science community on the science of sustainability, and yet progress has been so slow. And I think we need to be honest and ask why that has been the case. Is it, as Naki suggested earlier on today, because most of it has been within the silos, rather than the nexus thinking that's clearly needed? And we've seen today a lot more appeal to nexus thinking in the last presentations that we've seen. And of course, the Human Frontiers Project has all been about nexus thinking. This is the year of basic science, and obviously, therefore, it's the focus of this meeting. But I'm reminded that one person's basic science is another person's applied science, and I'm nervous about the language gets people to think if we need more of one, is it at the cost of the other? It can't be a zero-sum game. The term itself tends to make us think of the natural sciences, and yet, as we've just heard, the basic social sciences are more important than ever. We've already heard some of the questions that relate to sustainability, but some of the others might be, why do people not take long-term risk seriously? Why do politicians undermine long-term risk assessments? Why do they fail to listen to risk assessments? How do we overcome the biases that inhibit action? How are we going to deal with the inevitable constraints or problems in social cohesion when we face such dramatic change ahead? How will populations respond, and how do we get social license across different cultures for the many technologies that will emerge? These are fundamental questions in basic science. And science itself is siloed. as Marcia pointed out, we just have to look at the incentives to see that what's created the silos and the competition based on kudos and recognition. The institutions of science create silos. Universities, funders, research councils all favour disciplinary study. It's quite clear that cross-boundary research is harder to get through peer review. It's people who undertake it find it harder to get promoted. Their papers don't get easily published, and they have many other challenges in their career development. And this is particularly so when the natural and social sciences combine, and even more so when transdisciplinary research, and I'll come back to what I mean by transdisciplinarity because I think it's been misused several times today, is research is involved. Over the past 50 years, so much of science has been unnecessarily over-competitive, and that's extended to the organisation of science. We have far too many scientific organisations competing for attention, and yet they act in the same spaces. I can think of at least 10 organisations that claim to know what's best to do about the SDGs, and they all fight for attention and leave the policy community having to act as scientific referees. And they're probably the worst people to act as scientific referees. Wouldn't it be far better if these various initiatives coalesced and came to the policy community as one, and the ISC is reaching out now to see if we can act as a convener for doing so. I should point out the International Science Council is the world's premier non-governmental body, linking national academies, social sciences, associations and disciplinary bodies together. The term transdisciplinarity has been used a lot today. I think we need to be careful. There are multiple words at play here: interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. But transdisciplinarity has a few characteristics that distinguish it from other cross-disciplinary approaches, and it's important to understand what these are. It's framed through multiple lenses right from the outset, as the last speaker alluded to in his comments that we need in behavioural science to bring multiple domains together. It includes, importantly, the engagement of end users from civil society, private sector, and the policy community right from the outset. It's the processes of engagement that determine the research program, rather than us telling the whole society what the research project is. There's a growing consensus highlighted in the report done with IASA, Unleashing and ISC, Unleashing Science, that to make progress on the SDGs beyond pure technical solutions needs an emphasis on transdisciplinary research, a research modality that's virtually impossible to get funded at the present time. But the ISC report, The Future of Transdisciplinary Research, which I co-authored and was released a few weeks ago, makes clear that therefore to promote transdisciplinary research, fundamental institutional change is needed. New research tools are needed, new funding tools, new institutional practices, and new publication practices. This meeting's raised many issues. And as Marcia said at the beginning of this meeting, what is clear is something needs to change. Otherwise, we will not make progress on the SDGs. We will fail. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to the panel and ask them to comment, pull what I said to bits, or at least suggest other solutions. I'm going to ask, I've been told that Maria has to leave. So Maria, do you want to start by making a few comments? Yes.
Sorry, yes. Maria Lepton, President of the European Research Council. We actually have our Scientific Council meeting in Stockholm tomorrow, so I've got to catch a late flight. Thank you. So this has been fascinating and good fun, in particular to hear the science. And like I say, I'll just, we've been given a few questions, and I'll sort of give some thoughts in response to them. Are the funding mechanisms, do we need to change them? I think what we've seen here today is a number of really interesting comments, deep knowledge of what is needed, of the mechanisms that are happening that we need to figure out. Many of them are HFSP grantees and many of them are ERC grantees. So it seems to me that we're funding the right people, which must mean that we've got the right mechanisms. Of course, both organizations share the commitment to researcher-driven, curiosity-driven, fundamental research. And so I think that's a good mechanism. And peer review, much as some people would say it sucks, is actually somehow works. Of course, we constantly have to look about our research assessment, and I think both organizations do that. So the next point I would make is I'm really happy to have seen the social sciences mentioned here. Indeed, they get forgotten. They have become ever more important in understanding not how we mitigate the effects of the damage we've done, but how we deal with its effects on our lives, on our populations, on poverty, on migration, etc. So that is something, and again, it's really essential that that science would be continue to be funded. And again, I refer back to the ERC and the wisdom of the European taxpayer to allow the ERC to continue to be funded, hopefully at higher levels, and fund research in all those areas where it's not immediately obvious to everyone. Minister Retailleau this morning was concerned about the connection between the basic science and the applications that are needed for fundamental sustainability. I just think that is not true. There is huge connection, and we both have the researchers who themselves, after all, are citizens who are threatened by the situation that we're facing. But we also have mechanisms. So at the EU level, we have the ERC and the European Innovation Council, which is an excellent tool. But if you look at the applicants for the transition grants at the EIC, more than half of them are former ERC grantees. So how is the Innovation Council supposed to work if you don't do the ERC kind of research, the fundamental research in the first place? So I think there is no disconnect. Researchers from the fundamental science who either stumble on or deliberately do work that will guide them towards ideas, discoveries for innovation, they're there, they want to do it. And we're also asked about nice examples. And I want to use two examples from the talks just now. Martin Fisbeck said, the science we need for the oceans we want. Yes, let's do the science we need for the oceans we want. Trouble is, we don't necessarily know today what we need to deal with future problems. And the history of research is full of that, Maxwell didn't work on waves in order to invent a radio, but clever engineers who saw this invented the radio. So let's trust the scientists to research the world in order that those who want to innovate can make use of their stuff. And a final really good example is from Chris Bowler's talk, is Tara Oceans, which was started by a retired molecular cell biologist who knew about sequencing and who knew about microscopes, and who was also a sailor. And so he combined his passion for research and his passion for sailing. You don't need to be told to be interdisciplinary. Scientists, fundamental researchers will do it all by themselves if you give them the money.
But how policymakers act is the issue. Damerval, Director General of the Agence Naturelle Research.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, as President of ANR, the French National Research Agency, I wanted to say that we are very happy to be partner, a member of the organizing committee, of the steering committee of this summit and symposium, but in fact I'm participated in this panel as member of the board of Science Europe. Science Europe is an organization bringing together more than 40 research funding organization, research performing organization in Europe, and of course, concerning the question about science organization and funding models, it is clearly on the table, and many discussions are dealing with this question within Science Europe. Of course, as research organization, we must constantly question the meaning of our action and the relevance of our research support models. There is a study which has been performed between the Science Europe organization to see exactly what kind of new experience of funding instrument and research platform were explored to tackle the new challenges. 80 funding programs and 50 interdisciplinary research platforms have been identified. What we see is some very fundamental things remains, like peer review or so on. Now we see, of course, I will say 3 main trends. One is, of course, obviously the impact of artificial intelligence on many things. We have seen, of course, some example. The second point is the importance of evolving more young scientists. For example, there is some experiment building a multidisciplinary network of PhD students and postdocs and supporting policymakers dealing with science policy. The third point is to create new ways also of involving other stakeholders. The creation, for example, of platform gathering researchers from different fields, from basic science, industrial actors, and societal stakeholders. So it will be interesting to see, to share, of course, and learn from each other from these different experiments. It will be very important. We have to also dare to experiment new approaches with a way to support research, and again the importance of the training, higher education, and trusting young scientists. And now another point, and we'll be very short, it's the link with the science advice. And again, there is a report which is called Science Policy in Action, Insights for the Green and Digital Transition, that has been issued in last March for Science Europe, which shows that we have to recognize, assess, support activities to promote and encourage science-informed policymaking, to develop strategies of science-informed policymaking with a long-term vision to build trust and develop expertise, and providing scientific areas in all insight in all areas. So just to finish, I want to conclude by telling, and that's our policy also at INR, I would like really to stress the importance of and the need to support a high level of basic research in all fields, to give scientists a great deal of freedom to support largely curiosity-driven, investigator-driven projects alongside directed or mission-oriented program. The two approaches are necessary. They must not be compartmentalized. There must be interaction between the two, and a researcher or laboratory must be able to move from one to another and to go back. Thank you.
Thanks, Thierry. You raised an important issue, just in passing, which is trust in science, which is going to be one of the big challenges of the next period of time, particularly with what's happening in the disinformation world. And I think we need to distinguish between the mechanisms we have of producing trustworthy science, which is what funding bodies do and look to do with the universities, and the whole issues of perception of trust in science. And while we don't have time to discuss it today, I think it's one of the fundamental challenges of the research community moving ahead. I'd now like to introduce Anne Ephrussi, Director of Training at EMBIL, European Molecular Biology Lab. Have I got that
At the laboratory, yes. So I'm here representing the EMBIL, which is an intergovernmental organization. And I think for those of you who know the CERN, we're the life sciences, would say, counterpart of the CERN. And in fact, the EMBIL, which began in 1974, was the brainchild of scientists, including physicists like Leo Szilard. So the idea was it was the beginning of a revolution in molecular biology, and Cold Spring Harbor Lab was already going strong, and the idea was to actually bring molecular biology, which had foundations in Europe, which were referred to earlier with Jacques Monod, etc., but really strengthen it in Europe and provide a place for young scientists to come, launch their own research independently without going into what you could call silos of former professors, etc., and become independent that way. So now we have been going for almost 50 years, and EMBIL has 5 main missions. One, of course, is to conduct fundamental research in the life sciences, molecular biology, cell biology, structural biology, everything to do with life sciences, you could say, at the molecular level. But also we have a very strong mission in training, of which I'm in charge, also in technology transfer, infrastructure provision or development and service provision to scientists in the member states and beyond, and also, of course, integration of life sciences in Europe. And so we're very active on all these fronts. We are funded by 27 member states, and I would like to put a plug in here for some form of stable funding. Ours is by no means stable. It's negotiated every 5 years. In fact, today, this is why I'm here rather than Edith Hurd, our Director General, she's at the Council today. But the fact is that the continuity and the progress of the institution and the research there is guaranteed, in a sense, by the founding treaty of the institution. So over the years, science has evolved, and I would like to say that actually in our new indicative scheme, which began in 2022 with our new Director General, Edith Hurd, we have a whole new aspect of the life sciences we're tackling for the first time. We were very classical and very strong in molecular structural cell biology, and the new program is called Molecules to Ecosystems. And this is a project that was very strongly endorsed by the member states and that is going strong with, indeed, research now that is extending in all the directions that we heard about today, really reaching for more interdisciplinary and reaching into areas of biodiversity, also infectious diseases, topics we heard about that are so poignant and are so serious right now and will only get more, let's say, prominent in the future. Indeed, my friend and colleague Maria mentioned the TARA project that also Chris Bowler mentioned and is scientific director of. In fact, it was started by a scientist at EMBL who probably would never have done it had he not been at EMBIL, Eric Carcenti, who indeed was a sailor and all that, but realized how you could just take your ideas and run with them. If you are convinced, you can convince others. And of course, that project is still going very strong and was the inspiration for a major aspect of our new program, which is called TREK, which means traversing European coastlines, which involves research at the interface between water and land all around the European coastline. It's already started earlier this year. And indeed, it involves sampling and, of course, collection of data. We also, of course, run the EBI, which some of you may know, which is the European Bioinformatics Institute. It's in fact EMBIL EBI in Hingston, which is very, very important, not only in curating databases, collecting data, but also developing methods for data analysis, modeling, and so forth, and is very important on the European stage and worldwide, and was very visibly so at the time of the SARS-CoV-2 peak of the pandemic in terms of data provision and modeling. So I would like to say that we're also very conscious of the problem of silos. For years, we've been really pushing for more interdisciplinary research, but cautiously sticking one toe out. We're biologists, but also bridging fields in biology, now bringing in more and more physicists and other engineers. We've launched a program called ARISE to bring together non-biologist scientists and technology developers to confront questions in biology with EMBIL scientists and eventually become leaders in service provision and development of facilities in Europe and around the world for service provision. Finally, since time is short, I will say that for many, many years, in fact, 20 years ago, we started a Science and Society program. It was very strongly recommended by EMBO and EMBIL and the member states, and that has brought together scientists, but also members of the public and non-scientists every year in a symposium to really bring together the two and break this notion that if society doesn't like something about science, it's because they don't understand. Very often it's the scientists who do not understand the worries of society. And I think at EMBIL we've understood for a long time that it's not so simple and you need a dialogue, and that was the theme, opening a dialogue. And so this is continuing very, very strong, and with an additional now big program under the training program of a citizen science program, and indeed part of the TREC project is training and interfacing with teachers and students all along the coastline and in all the member states. I will stop here. We're big advocates of interdisciplinarity and indeed doing what we can with our member states, serving them, training their members and others to take these challenges on, which we take, of course, very seriously.
And your comments raise the dilemma of individual scientists versus team-based science. And our institutions are largely based historically on individuals, when in fact teams are what's emerging as being key, and they're dynamic teams that change over time.
May I say a word to that? I think the philosophy at EMBIL has always been small labs. You have to collaborate. And that allows you to collaborate very dynamically. You address a question, and then you identify the next person who will be your best collaborator even further out.
In the interest of time, we better move on. I'm going to introduce Ted Hewitt, who's chair of the Canadian, I'm not quite sure of your title, Ted. You better say what you are.
Canada Research Coordinating Committee. So thank you, Sir Peter. I have to agree, with everything you said. I'm around the need for multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. I don't think this really emerges organically quite the way we think it does. I think it is a design issue. But I'll tell you, in Canada, we were very, very fortunate. The heads of the granting councils, and we're all here today, actually, Strong and Alejandro. We received about $140 million Canadian to create a fund called the New Frontiers in Research Fund. And government said, in its wisdom, we want you to do something different. We want you to create a fund that's going to create or promote high risk, high reward, international, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research. What we found out instantly was it's a lot easier to design a call and a set of calls than it is to implement it. Because, and this is where rubber really hit the road and where we did some really fascinating things. I mean, one thing we realized is if we didn't construct it properly, we were just going to draw the usual suspects back to the call. So how do you get more, and how do you promote risk-taking? How do you get more early career researchers engaged? How do you integrate principles around equity, diversity, inclusion? So you broaden the pool. So that was key. And so what we did was we changed up the way we constructed the call, turned to the use of things like biosketches as opposed to CVs, implemented a number of the DORA principles. But it's peer review where rubber really hits the road, because we knew if we're doing or trying to assess interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work, you can't put deep disciplinary experts on panels or they just kill stuff. And most peer reviewers have an inclination to want to kill projects as opposed to take risks. And so we had to introduce some measures to find the right people to sit on panels and serve as expert reviewers who had broad interdisciplinary experience. We introduced other measures like proportional funding for early career researchers. 30% ERCs apply, 30% will be funded. We had occasion to attempt a lottery as well and see how that would go. That's an interesting one. Encouraging peer reviewers to be risk takers. So, when we monitor this, we've created some really innovative calls, and I'll stop there. My colleagues are well aware of on the UN Research Roadmap, and the SDGs were a big part of that. We went out in support of that particular venture that was led actually by CHR in Canada on behalf of the UN. We also created the International Climate Change Mitigation or Adaptation call. That we went out, found 6-8 partners, doubled our stake to about 100 million for one call on climate change adaptation, which is now in progress, with all the principles that I've just described to you, and with all the other funders buying in eventually on that model.
Thanks, Ted. As some of you know, I just chaired the international panel reviewing UK REF mechanism. And one of the key things we pointed out there was, particularly as we move into interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research, the need to focus on reviewing the process rather than the people, and that the processes are actually key to whether the research is going to be successful or not. Now I'd like to turn to Valerie Masson-Delmotte, co-chair of the IPCC. Valerie?
Thank you very much. And first of all, my presentation will start by a question to all, and by a question to all. And in between, I would like to share a few thoughts. Thanks to each of you who has supported the work of scientists to develop new knowledge, the work of IPCC authors. Without new knowledge, no IPCC report. Without the volunteer, unpaid work and dedication of scientists, no IPCC report. But without the co-production with governments, no relevance for IPCC reports. So my first question is, amongst the audience here, who of you has read a summary for policymakers of one of our IPCC reports? Thank you so much. And it shows the importance of building on huge scientific assessments developed across disciplines to inform the understanding of, first of all, where we are and why. Second, what are the possible futures, including the risks. On that matter, one example of knowledge advances, since the 1979 first US Academy of Science report on the climate system, we've only now managed to reduce by a factor of 2 the uncertainty of the climate system response. And this is due to advances in basic research, from past climates, from processes and feedbacks, from observations, so that we could constrain projections. And it gives a sense of the time scale of deep knowledge developments. So what our reports show is also not just the urgency of changing scale, but also the agency. What is the knowledge on how to accelerate shifts towards net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, how to accelerate shifts towards a climate resilient development? And there are multiple options available now. Technological advances resulting from research advances, nature-based solutions where we better understand our interdependency on ecosystems and their services, and our own lifestyles demand cooperation, social safety nets as well. So, 33 years after the first IPCC report in 1990, is it a success story or a collective failure in terms of the science policy interface? Climate action is advancing, but clearly not at scale. Record amount of greenhouse gas emissions, record influence of human activities on the global climate system in the last decade, and even the largest recorded rate of warming in the last decade. So we're not there yet, and we are weak as a community. We are weak in the face of merchants of doubt, disinformation, targeting the general public, targeting decision makers. We're not organized enough. Despite all we can do to develop the best state of knowledge, we're still weak in how we react to disinformation strategies, which are strengthened by social networks and sometimes artificial intelligence tools as well. When we do our assessments, we have to be neutral within IPCC, no prescription. We look at each response options and then, the potential and limits, enabling conditions and barriers, co-benefits and trade-offs with sustainable development goals. And this is a weakness, because what policymakers are looking for is a roadmap. They're not just looking for a neutral assessment. So how not to just have science to empower transformations, but how to empower scientists who understand the state of knowledge, how to value their role as watchdogs of public policies within local, national scientific councils, looking at what works, what does not work, and providing guidance for effective adaptation and mitigation. We are ahead of multiple gaps, mitigation gaps, investment gaps, adaptation gaps. They're huge. How do we value the role of scientists as engaging in conversations? There are different words, visions, and values. It was clearly highlighted. We need scientists to be able to engage in these conversations. One aspect of climate action is climate and biodiversity literacy. It is striking for me that when I look at, for instance, health, higher health education, people who are trained to be medicine doctors, nurses, or other works, they have no training in climate and biodiversity knowledge. And this is a major failure we have. It's the same in business schools, the same in political sciences or public administration studies. How to empower scientists to bridge and to facilitate the enhancement of climate literacy for those who will be decision makers in other fields. When we do the most integrated assessment to date, the Climate Change and Land Report, it was valued, addressing biodiversity, adaptation, mitigation, land desertification, land degradation, all aspects. It's the one least used in public policies. It's not linked to anything really at the scale of what would be needed for the transformations of the food system, and it was clearly highlighted. So it's not just an issue of new knowledge, it's an issue of making that knowledge available and relevant to inform transformations at scale. We're also facing huge limits for the IPCC exercise. Thousands of authors, thousands of contributors, 85,000 peer review publications assessed, 300,000 review comments. It's unsustainable. IPCC reports, if they are to stay relevant and to motivate scientists to join them, they need to be supported by regional assessments, targeted reviews. At the moment, it's at the limit of feasibility, and it leads to burnout of some of the authors and contributors, which is not acceptable at all. Next time, what is key for shifting development pathways? Equity, justice, knowledge. But we're not there yet either. Which space here for early career scientists? Which discussion for the support needed for knowledge advances in the most vulnerable countries, the least advanced countries, the small islands? They call for knowledge, they call for data, they call for climate information so that they can manage risks. They need to be heard. 3.8% of climate research funding, only 3.8% goes to Africa, which is one of the most vulnerable continents. The topics are dictated by donors. They are not defined by African scientists, and that's what they write in IPCC reports. Ethics is critical for just transitions, for avoiding maladaptation, but also for how we approach knowledge gaps. When we assess the state of knowledge, we look at what has matured, but what cannot be assessed, what are the knowledge gaps. If it's written clearly in our reports, it is instrumentalized by governments during climate negotiations to try to weaken the solid conclusions. How to help IPCC to help identify knowledge gaps in a way that will not be used to undermine the key solid findings. How to empower IPCC to not just provide guidelines for emission inventories, but also impact inventories which matter for the loss and damage conversation. How to make clear that IPCC is supported to make advances for aspects associated currently with deep uncertainty, tipping points, hard limits, water availability, biomass availability for transformations, knowledge in the most vulnerable areas, feedbacks from ecosystem degradation, climate information for biodiversity, carbon-rich ecosystems. We don't have that yet. And in order to provide relevant assessments, this knowledge has to be supported and developed. One last term related to ethics. There are points for me of deep vigilance. At the moment, there is huge philanthropic funding for geoengineering solar modification research for Global South scientists. What does it say? What are the values, the visions of the world, and the power relationships behind this choice of funding geoengineering and not other parts that are equally important? Last question, responsible science. To limit warming to low levels, and we're going to 1.5 warming, it's a failure for the most stringent ambition of the Paris Agreement. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by several % per year. It's a fact. Who of you is monitoring the carbon footprint of your lab, institution, department, ministries, and reducing it at scale. Who is doing that here? If we are not showing the example as scientists, if we are not a powerhouse of transformations, who will believe us? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Valerie. And again, we see the point that Valerie makes so well. We can do all the lovely science in the lab, but if we can't change the way societies and policymakers work, then is it actually doing anything? And that's the key issue of this particular day. And finally, I'm going to turn to my old friend Lidia Brito, who's currently acting Deputy Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences at UNESCO. A job you've had for just a few days.
Thank you very much, Peter. I have to say that Valerie just gave me the will to answer to some of your questions, not really as a UNESCO person, but as a person in global science. But first of all, let me say how happy I am to be here. I just arrived in Paris last week, and I'm just starting back into headquarters. And I couldn't be in a better place to really start looking at natural science in UNESCO with fresh eyes and see what we can do. And I want to touch maybe on the point that you were talking about on trust in science, that also goes back to Valerie and Ted and some of the other speakers. And this idea of the science policy society interface. We can't have two interfaces, science policy, science society. It has to be an interface where really society, because we are lucky that we have a much more inclusive society than we had before. But we needed science to really inform and really create a scientific culture, going even beyond literacy, but really a scientific culture, a questioning, a curiosity-based culture in our societies that will force us to always look, for answers to questions that bother us, that we heard from others. And so the interface has to do also with creating this scientific culture, both on the political, but also on the society environment. And I always say, why no more scientists going to politics? Would be great to have really presidents, prime ministers that could really understand the core of science. And we have seen that in some places, governors and etc., that have changed their provinces because they use science and science-based decision-making to really change. And in Colombia, we have some examples of that I think is quite interesting. The other one is this discussion, trust in science, of co-design and co-production. And as you were mentioning, it's more than just talking among scientists. It's also talking to stakeholders, it's also talking to beneficiaries. It's also involving young people from the beginning to really having a science that is much more responsive to society, independently if it's on the basic science, on the fundamental sciences. The questions, the curiosity should also come from the challenges we face in the planet as humanity and etc. Because it's also, there is a lot of things that we should question and be curious about, as we heard in the beautiful presentations this afternoon. So being curious, but is also doing responsible science. So let's be curious about the issues that we are facing and how can we really, through fundamental science, really come up with other approaches to solutions that are important. And I think there also the question of institutions and changes of institutions. And Ted, again, you talked about that. I was part once of one of the juries that was analyzing your big grants for innovative. Yes, I was there. It was really very interesting because we were all different. And some of them were like, oh, but I really don't know this area of knowledge. But I know the impact, I know the question that started that proposal from a scientific point of view. And that changed very much the process, but also for us as juries, because I think we learned quite a lot from each other and became much easier also to look at that. So the institutional, the competition that you were talking, that needs to come to be transformed to collaboration, the importance of for me, when we say intersectorial, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, social science is there. I don't think we are in a point where we are questioning what science are we talking about in terms of integration. We need to have clear all the sciences together, working together to solve this. And finally, some things that we do, and allow me to preach a little bit on the open science recommendation that we had approved our member states in 2021. And I think the importance of having this instrument, this recommendation, is that really is opening the possibility to looking at collaboration, to looking at constructing knowledge, of the right to benefit from scientific knowledge, but the right to participate in the creation of scientific knowledge. It allows us as a global community in science really to have a common framework that we should work. We are now preparing our outlook on what are the open science instruments, mechanisms, policies around the world that are indeed already bringing changes. And I don't believe that we can have science for sustainable development if it's not open science, and if it's not equitable, if it's not inclusive. And I think you mentioned very correctly, we are forgetting more than half of the world when we are discussing here. And what is more dramatic is that half of the world are the youth world. So all the new scientists in the world, most of them will come from the South, because that's where we have the young people in enough numbers to have the top scientists that we need today and in the future. So I think, Valerie, your point also that is about capacity building, about changing also our higher education institutions, the curricula, from a natural science point of view or from a social science point of view, it should finish. We should say, I want to study climate sciences. What are the different subjects that I need to take from the different faculties and schools in order for me to be an effective, and just finalizing this, and go back to the funding issue. Maybe in Europe you have it resolved. We don't have that globally, and is not in enough scale. Transformative science to transform needs scale. We cannot do little things up here and there. It is really a question of scale. And for scale, we need funding. And for funding, we need long-term funding and different kinds of funding. And I think we can't, I would say, at least from a UNESCO point of view, this is one of the areas that together with ISC and other agencies, global agencies, really saying we have to address the issue of funding for science, for sustainable development, and the science that is open, inclusive, and just. Thank you.
If you treat the European Union as one entity, less than 2% of the global research funds are available for cross-jurisdictional research. That's the fundamental reality, and yet the issues are global. The last speaker is Pascal Bracconot, who's Vice Chairman of WCRP, the World Climate Research Programme, which is a partnership between WMO, ISC and UNESCO.
Yes, so thank you. I will have a slightly different voice because it's more on organization and what the science we want to do and achieve, and how we can also reach some of the goals or call that is there. So that's clear that the objectives of the World Climate Research Programme are aligned with the question we had today, so for sure. And the community has made lots of progress in understanding climate, climate change. And it's thanks to that that we know somehow that human is really a cause in the what is going on. And we're also producing the famous projections that are really, I would say, instrumental somehow for lots of thinking behind the research we are doing with that. So that's very important. We raised the voice, maybe I said this here, because we also had this concern in the program to hear about the voice of the young people, the young generation, new methodologies, new ways of thinking, and also people from the global south. And at our conference we have in Kigali this autumn, we clearly have a symposium for them, and we will give them the voice so that they bring their own views and maybe their own projects within the conference, and I hope after the conference too. When we think about climate in between life and sustainability, let's sure that we have something in common that even for the Earth history, I would say, it's a co-evolution of ecosystems and climate. And finally, climate is all of that. It's not only the weather, it's all this connection with life on Earth, even if we do not do it, this connection every day. We need to understand them to be able to understand climate and climate change. So we have all these things to do together. And then, as we said, there is not enough connection with that between ecosystem or biology. But there's more and more about it between people, and I think multidisciplinary research happens too when people are able to share common methodologies. And in that case, the problem for them is to solve the questions. It is not mandatory to do it. And it's where people are happy to work together and you have new ideas. So this is also something important. It's also important that this can be aligned at the international levels, because each of the questions we have is not only for one people. It's much more than that. We have big agendas, big difficulties, and I think one of the really important things we have to think about now is these connections between global scale and more regional and local scales. And why? Because we cannot disconnect them. Climate is not only regional, right? But people are living at regions, and the ecosystem might be very particular to regions. And then we have limits that are planetary limits in the physical behavior of the system or the biological one. And then we have all what we can do on a specific scale at the territorial scales with all the actors. And this is really important. And I say this because you do not necessarily have the same kind of science and the same kind of people around the table when doing this. That means that there needs mutual understanding that the questions are slightly different, but they are connected. And this is a big deal. And if we do not go as fast as we would like, there's a lot that has to do with this. Is mutual understanding about the different questions and accept that everybody is not tackling the same question the same way, but it's a piece in the world system. So when we think about also what we have in common, we heard about this already today, and there will be also in the title for the symposium. There's a lot to do now also about the extremes. What are these extremes? They are very diverse. Some are only climate, some are only weather, some are with crises in the biology, and crises for food, and so on. So it's all in between us, and it's very important also to better understand them. They are different. They have different impacts. They can also, depending on the sectoral activity or what we're looking at. So the definition for an extreme and its impact is very different, can be very different when we go from one sector to the other. And this needs a lot of science to understand. We cannot go too fast in some cases, or we might do very strange things. We have example also about its stress, for example, for health. So it's very important. There is more and more on that. So it's not only heat. It has also to do with humidity for human life. And when you think about it also, you have some disease. We discussed that for health, and like mosquitoes for malaria, for example, or other kind of disease. But then when you look at that, they will change with time, these mosquitoes and so on. They can be affected also by these different heat stress and heat waves, and depending on the countries, but there are different species. They are doing things differently. So then if you really want to make sure you have good measures for health, you need to understand the environment. You need to understand all the details and put people together. And then there is trust. It's not only exchanges of data, it's also exchanges of knowledge to go one step further. So what we have also is the recognition more and more, and it has been really well highlighted in the last IPCC report or the synthesis, that there are multi-stressors and multi-factors. And this also, and there can be cascading effects, and we need to really think about it. And a way to have people working all together is also to put some of these questions in the middle of different communities so that each of them comes with its own views, and then it can produce something really different from what we were used to have. And I would recommend to have this kind of incubators so that people meet. And also that multidisciplinary is very important, but also at the same time you have agendas in the different disciplines that are also very important to make good progresses. So it has to be recognized, and both agendas have to be discussed together so that people can come together, go back, and come again, and so on. So that is quite fluid, the way people interact. So maybe I stop here for now.
Thank you. We need to finish. But in finishing, just to make the comment and thanking all the speakers, that we need to recognize that we're not talking about either or. There's a need for fundamental basic science, but there's a need for mechanisms that integrate sciences and integrate sciences with society, and as Valerie pointed out very well, integrate what we know with the policy makers who ultimately make the choices. And at the moment, they're not listening well to science, and we need to reflect on our role in that as much as just blaming them for not listening to us. Thank you very much.